Good morning and welcome to the 25th meeting of the Education and Skills Committee in 2019. Can I remind everyone present to turn mobile phones and other devices to silent for the duration of the meeting. Apologies have been received from Alison Harris and Jerry Ruth, and we have Oliver Mundell and Gil Patterson substituting for them today, so welcome to committee. And we've also received apologies from Beatrice Wishart this morning. Agenda item 1 is a decision on taking business in private, and I would ask the committee if they're content to take agenda items 5 and 6 in private. Thank you. Agenda item 2 is subordinate legislation. It is the provision of early learning and childcare specified children Scotland Amendment Order 2019 S5M 18219, which the draft subordinate legislation is subject to affirmative procedure. Information about the instrument is provided in paper 1, and there is also a submissions pack including letters from the Minister on issues raised during our scrutiny of the previous affirmative motion on funded childcare. I would explain that an affirmative instrument has 2 agenda items. Firstly, the committee will have an opportunity to ask questions of the ministers and our officials, and after that we will turn to agenda item 3, where there will be a formal debate on the motion that is published in the agenda. So I would like to welcome to committee this morning Marie Todd, MSP, Minister for Children and Young People, Dr Alison Cumming, Deputy Director of Early Learning and Childcare, and Claire Cullen, Solicitor, School Education Branch, Legal Directorate of the Scottish Government. And I would like to invite Ms Todd to make an opening statement.
Good morning, Convener. The eligibility criteria for the funded early learning and childcare offer for 2-year-olds are set out in legislation and include looked after children and children who are subject to kinship care or a guardianship order. The funded provision also covers children whose parents receive certain qualifying benefits, for example, universal credit and those legacy benefits that will be superseded by universal credit. This order is concerned with one of these qualifying benefits. Our legislation currently specifies that a 2-year-old is eligible where a parent receives a maximum child tax credit and maximum working tax credits with an annual income that does not exceed a threshold set in UK regulations, currently 6,420 or less. Due to changes in UK government policy, it is now technically no longer possible for a parent aged 25 or over to meet this criterion. The UK government has decided to increase the national living wage, but it has also frozen income thresholds for the maximum award of working tax credits and child tax credits at 6,420. The combined effect of these changes is that a parent over 25 working the minimum hours to qualify for working tax credits at 16 hours a week can now earn no less than around £6,800. Left unchanged, these UK government policies would result in a significant decrease in the number of 2-year-old children eligible for funded early learning and childcare in Scotland, despite there being no real significant difference in the household circumstances of these families. Scottish Government and local government are agreed that we don't wish to see these children unable to access funded early learning and childcare. It's important to be clear that no 2-year-old who is currently receiving funded early learning and childcare will be affected by these changes, because once a child has met the eligibility criteria, they remain eligible despite any change in circumstances. The purpose of this order is to protect eligibility for 2-year-olds we would expect to be eligible for funded early learning and childcare. This order will increase the income threshold to £7,320 per year for households in receipt of both child tax credit and working tax credits. And that will mean a similar profile of children will remain eligible for the entitlement, ensuring that those 2-year-old children who stand to benefit the most will continue to have early access to high-quality funded early learning and childcare. Stakeholders representing children and families, including Save the Children and One Parent Family Scotland, have indicated their support for this order. Our local government colleagues and COSLA representatives are supportive of this legislative change. Whilst we do not expect there to be significant financial impact for local authorities, we have agreed measures with COSLA to monitor and to respond to any impact jointly. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I'll now move to questions from the committee, and I'll invite Mr Johnson first.
Thank you very much, Convener. So just looking at the numbers on this, our understanding from the policy note is that without this change, the number of eligible 2-year-olds would decrease by 4,000. I was just wondering if you could outline what proportion of the 14,000 children which are currently eligible are actually taking up those places and how you think this might impact that.
Absolutely. So you're quite right. We need this SSI to protect the eligibility of those people, those children that we are trying to target. At the moment, we think about 25% of the 2-year-old population in Scotland is eligible, and at the moment around 10% of the whole 2-year-old population take up this offer. That's around 40% of the eligible children. We're putting in a lot of work across the board to improve that uptake, a number of measures in place which I can elaborate on if you want, but yeah, at the moment it's about 40% uptake of those people who are eligible.
Well, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit. My understanding is in 2018 you committed to doubling the take-up to 60%. It sounds as though some progress has been made on that, if you're saying it's 40% take-up. But what steps are you taking to ensure maximum take-up of this important benefit?
This is an absolutely key aim for this government because we recognise that the ELC expansion will deliver real benefits to these children and families. We think it will improve the poverty-related attainment gap. More parents will have the opportunity to be in training and work and study, and family resilience will improve. So we're very keen, and our local authority partners are very keen to ensure that this offer is that parents and children who are eligible are aware of this offer and encouraged to take it up. So we're working together with local authority and private and third sector services to work towards increasing the intake. At a national level, the Scottish Government's been working with the Children and Young People Improvement Collaborative since September 2018 to support 9 local authorities in multi-agency teams to to use improvement methodology to increase awareness and uptake of 2-year-old funded ELC. And that's due to report this month, and then we'll be taking the lessons that those 9 local authorities have learned and sharing them across the country. We're also working with the UK government to develop a legal gateway and a data sharing agreement. So you'll be aware that in England, the local authorities have had access to DWP data that helps them to identify the eligible parents since 2011. So we've been working very hard with the UK government to try to deliver that legal gateway so that our local authorities can also identify these families and target the offer. And we'll also are working to improve the information that's given to parents and carers to help them to make informed decision about ELC, so that once we have identified these parents and carers and once we are able to give them the offer, we give them good information that helps them to make a good decision about whether it suits their family circumstances or not to take it up.
Forgive me, Minister, but what does that actually mean? I mean, you said the government's working with local authorities and working with the national government. What actually is the content of that work? Given that your own figures say that 20% of people who are eligible don't take up because they're not aware of the possibility of this provision. What are actually those steps? What is the information you're providing, and how are you communicating this scheme?
So we're improving the information available to parents and carers to help them to make informed decisions about ELC, particularly through the ELC Hub Parent Club. And we're continually exploring opportunities to promote the 2-year-old offer through other services such as the financial health check, the new Best Start payments, the health visiting pathway, where ELC is included in a topic that can be discussed at child health development reviews. I have to say, I think that the unlocking of this is really will really be supported by this legal gateway. Since I became Minister, we've been working, trying to ensure that we can obtain this legal gateway through the UK government. And it has been a real frustration, the slowness of progress, but I can report to the committee today that we have made progress on that. We have had agreement back in July that a legal gateway is required for this situation, and we are working with the UK Government legal drafters to draft legislation which will be out for consultation, I hope, before the end of the year. And obviously it would be very welcome if this committee would consider responding to that consultation. And then there will be work ongoing. Unfortunately, we will be absolutely at the mercy of the UK Government Parliament, the UK parliamentary timetable over the next year, but we're very keen to see that progress through Parliament and become law. Alongside that, we're working on the technical aspects of that. So as well as obtaining the legal gateway, we are working very hard in government here to find out how we're actually going to use that gateway, and so that we will be able, once the gateway is in place, we'll be able to hit the ground running in terms of ensuring that we get this offer out where it's required.
Okay, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Mr Gray.
Thanks very much. Minister, when you were here in May, I think I asked you some questions around deferral children who defer entry to primary one, and I appreciate that you've provided quite a lot of response in advance of today's meeting. And that response is really about how you intend to collect information on these children about a whole range of characteristics: gender, ethnicity, disability, additional support needs, home postcode, and so on. And that's interesting, but I'm puzzled where this is going. Once you know these characteristics about deferred children, what do you intend to change?
So you're quite right. Over the summer, my officials have been working, reviewing the current data and working with COSLA to consider other sources of data to better inform our understanding of deferral and uptake of ELC. And I have written to you to inform you of that work. I believe that the new EL census will help us to understand the picture around deferral. You'll remember and recall that at that committee there was a suggestion that certain groups in society were particularly disadvantaged around deferral decisions, and I think we need to understand that picture better before making decisions about what we do going forward on that issue.
But the core disadvantage here has nothing to do with any of these characteristics, does it? The core disadvantage is that a child whose parent exercises their absolute right to defer, whose birthday lies between August and December, will be denied free funded hours, early learning and childcare. How is counting these children going to help address that?
So that's not correct at all, Mr Gray. Automatically, any child who is not 5 when they start school in August is entitled to defer that year. For children who are born in January and February, there is an automatic entitlement to funded further ELC. For children who are born between August and December, that right to funded ELC is not automatic. A decision must be made along with the local authority. And what I'm doing to improve that decision making and to improve consistency around the country is bringing in statutory guidance which will help local authorities to involve parents in the decision making, to ensure that the decision is made on the principles of getting it right for every child. And we're also working hard to improve communication. So if you remember...
I'm sorry, are you suggesting that you want to try and change those parents' minds about deferral?
No, not at all.
Well, you said to work with the parents to ensure they've made the right decision.
Absolutely.
The decision is entirely theirs.
So one of the things that we established was that parents were getting a very different response when they asked about deferral in different parts of the country. What we want to do is ensure that there is a consistent response and that the decision will be made around the principles of getting it right for every child, along with the parents, as part of that decision-making process.
But the decision about deferral is not the local authorities to make. The decision about deferral is the parents to make.
Absolutely.
Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. But the decision about funding...
So if the parent, makes a decision to defer, as they are entitled in law to do, they will be denied the automatic funding of the funded hours, 1140 hours after next year, that would deny that automatic right to early years. That's the unfairness, isn't it?
So the situation at the moment, as I've been very clear, is that those parents are free to decide around deferment. The decision where there is discretion from the local authority is whether that deferment should be funded or not.
Okay, and you have no intention of changing that then?
I'm not saying I have no intention of changing it. What I'm saying is that I require more information in order to make that decision. I'm meeting with the Give Them Time campaign later this month, and I want to discuss the progress that we've made with some of the asks that they had with their campaign and what more might be required to ensure that they fulfil the aims of their campaign. Their work so far has been incredible, and they have done really well to highlight this issue and to improve the level of communication around it. And I'll certainly be happy to discuss with them when I meet them at the end of this month any future options that they want to explore with me.
Okay.
Mr Patterson?
Convener, you may have already have answered this question when you, in your introduction, when you were talking about working with the COSLA, but just in case of any doubt, the fact of the cohort of vulnerable children and families that would benefit from this, and if there is perhaps a shortfall in the delivery with regards to local government, will there be funds made available in that case?
So we've worked really hard with local authorities to understand the potential financial impact, and we expect that it will be manageable within the current ring-fenced early learning and childcare settlement, which includes provision for a higher uptake of two-year-old offer than is currently the case. And we've agreed with our local authority colleagues that we will that we will monitor the impact of this legislative change, and if any action is required in future, both sides are absolutely committed to taking that action. This is a high priority for us in central government. It's a high priority for local authority as well. We're very keen to work together on this and to make sure that this particular group of families are effectively targeted, because we think it will have such a transformative impact for them.
I kind of got that idea in your preamble, but I think it's worthwhile putting on the public record. And maybe if I could ask just a general question about childcare. I was impressed with your answer to a question in regards to using a bridge analogy. And you spoke about before you can cross a bridge, you need to build it first. So I wonder about the general infrastructure and the questions that arise with both the complement of staff that's required for the change over the period and, of course, the estate that's required, the places for people to go, for children and families to go. I'm just wondering how you feel about that. Are we making progress? Are they within these targets that you have set for the end game? And I get the bridge analogy, it's right. That will be the time when you've targeted the finish line. How are we at that in regards to that?
I'm confident that we are going to be able to deliver our commitment in August 2020. We have a joint delivery board with a number of local authority partners and care inspectorate partners round the table. We look very closely at both intelligence and data. The last data collection was in April. We proactively published that data collection. I think there was we're keen to make sure that everybody who would be interested in the progress of this is able to access that data. So I think in future we'll make sure we let this committee know when we're publishing that information. But we are confident that we are absolutely where we would expect to be at this moment in time. And, you know, as I've said many times when I've been criticised for the fact that we aren't quite there yet, we have a year to go. And the analogy I used was the Queensferry crossing. Nobody expected to be driving over that Queensferry crossing a year before it was ready.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much. That's fine, Minister. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Allen?
Thank you, Convener. You mentioned there the fact that you had a concern perhaps that different criteria had been being used around the country by different local authorities when it came to measuring some of the issues around the child's readiness to go to school and what that meant for funding decisions. Can you say a bit more about what kind of criteria you would like to see local authorities using and how you would like to see that standardised, if you like?
So is this with regard to the deferral
Decision,
issue?
or the funding around deferral decisions and the test, if you like, that local authorities apply around that?
Yeah, I mean, we're very clear in central government that the children should be, schools should be child ready rather than the children having to be school ready. And we are very keen that the decision around deferral should be made in a child-centred way. We have seen that there were a number of different deferral policies, and there were concerns from parents that they weren't able to even see those deferral policies. So we've worked really hard with local authorities to improve that, to take a more child-centred approach and to make sure that the policies are available and transparent for parents to access and work together with their local authority to make a good decision. There are real improvements happening around the country. There are significant changes happening. So as well as hopefully improved quality decision making, more standardised criteria, there's also a significant shift happening in the way that education is delivered. So for example, last week I visited a school in Wester Hales, Canal View Primary, where they made the decision a couple of years ago to switch over to play-based pedagogy in the early years of school as well as in the ELC. And that's made a significant difference to the children going to school about how straightforward their transition is and how ready they are and how able they are to take advantage of the education that's on offer in early primary. So there's an awful lot of change happening. And I am confident that we will make progress on this.
Thank you.
Okay, Ms Smith.
Could I just seek clarification on something you said just now, Minister? I may have misheard slightly. That you made a comment there that you wanted the schools to be ready for the children rather than the children to be ready to go to school. Can you just explain what you mean by that?
So, well, the example I gave in Canal View is exactly that. So the early years of school, these are very young children, so some of the concerns that are expressed around deferral is that these children are not ready to sit yet at desks, for example, and to write. I went to Canal View Primary last week, where they're using a play-based pedagogy. I walked into the primary school classrooms, and it looks just like a nursery. There's free play. The work is child-led. And they have made significant improvements in their acquisition of language and numeracy as a result of that change.
So do you make that comment because you feel that the provision of places is not entirely in line with the demands for parents with the children who are going to be in these places?
So I think that one of the concerns expressed by parents is that who wish to defer is that they do not want their children to go into a school environment, a more formal learning environment, age 5. And what I'm saying is there is a significant shift happening in early years education in schools in Scotland, where there is a more evidence of a play-based pedagogy in the early years, and that transition is not as challenging for many children in Scotland.
So just to confirm, the Scottish Government is having very extensive conversations with councils about this?
Yes, always.
Ms McCann.
Thank you. Yes, I wonder if you could just... one of the criticisms of the current situation is that the assessment of the child has been made, or whether they're ready for deferral has been made by people who don't sufficiently know the child well enough or the real background to that child. Is that something you see changing? Is that something you'll be in discussion with the Give Them Time group about?
Yes, certainly. So certainly, undoubtedly, I've heard stories from around the country where parents felt they haven't been involved in the decision, and that's not appropriate. Parents should absolutely be at the centre of this decision. So, as I said, we're refreshing the statutory guidance so that that will hopefully improve the quality of decision making, and parents in particular will feel that they have been well informed and are involved in that decision.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that exhausts questions from the committee. Can I now move to agenda item 3, which is a formal debate on motion S5M 18219 in the name of the Minister. I remind everyone that officials are not permitted to contribute to the formal debate, and ask that the Minister move the motion.
Moved.
Okay. Can I invite any contributions from members of the committee? I will now put the question to the committee. The question is that motion S5M 18219 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Yes. Thank you. The committee must report to Parliament on this instrument. Are members content for me as convener to sign off a report to the Parliament on the instrument? Agreed. Thank you. And I will now thank the Minister and our officials for attendance at committee and suspend to allow witnesses to change over. Already, thank you very much. The next item of business is agenda item 4, which is an evidence session on the impact of Brexit on higher education. And can I welcome to committee Liam McCabe, President of NUS Scotland, Mary Senior, Scotland official for UCU Scotland, and Alistair Sim, Director of Universities Scotland. And I would like to invite people to do an introductory comment for the committee. So, Mr McCabe, would you like to go first?
Of course. First of all, thank you very much for giving myself and NUS Scotland the opportunity to reflect on the impact of Brexit on the higher education sector. Just for those who might not be aware, NUS Scotland represents about 500,000 students across the country through our membership in colleges and university student associations and student unions. We work to promote, defend and extend the rights of students and to champion strong students' associations both in colleges and indeed in universities too. NUS Scotland welcomes the opportunity to give evidence to the Education and Skills Committee today on the impact of Brexit on higher education, but wish to make clear at this early stage that Brexit will have a significant impact on our further education sector too, and the opportunities available to further education students and apprentices. Now, since 2016, NUS has been campaigning to ensure that the final Brexit deal, which is offered, whenever one might be offered, delivers the best possible scenario for students, and have been pushing for a people's vote on any deal since 2018. We've been calling for the UK to remain a member of the Erasmus Plus scheme, both now and into the future, for a fair and accessible immigration system after Brexit, protection of vital funding, and a clear agreement on how the movement of people, goods and services will operate on the island of Ireland post-Brexit, and safeguard the rights and protections in the Good Friday Agreement. Now, NUS presidents, myself in Scotland and my colleagues in Wales, the North of Ireland and for the wider UK membership, have written to the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, to outline our concerns about the prorogation of the UK Parliament and the impact of a no-deal Brexit in a more general sense. This letter has been attached to NUS Scotland's written submission for your benefit. And I'll wrap up there to give as much time as possible for questions.
Thank you. Ms Senior.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to echo Liam's thanks to the committee for looking at this issue and for inviting us to give evidence today from the University and College Union. We're a trade union that represents academic and professional support staff in Scotland's universities. And I think the first point I really want to make is that education doesn't observe national borders or geographic boundaries. Education is about breaking new ground, driving innovation, sharing ideas and pushing knowledge boundaries. And I think the fact that Scotland attracts staff and students to come and live, work and study in Scotland is actually a great strength to us. They're contributing to making our sector world-class, our campuses vibrant and diverse and multicultural centres for learning and knowledge exchange. So I think that's all a positive. And I think, you know, Brexit has come along and really created so much uncertainty, chaos, crisis and fear. And I think particularly for those people working and studying in our universities in Scotland who are EU nationals or indeed other overseas staff, you know, this has created so much uncertainty, there's so much fear around and there's so much confusion, I think, in terms of the messages that we're getting out of the UK government. It's really difficult to sit here and to say, you know, what's going to happen on the 1st of November, and that's been true for the last 3 years because we really don't know. And so that's so damaging, I think, for our sector in Scotland, and it's the antithesis of what education is about. And then I also want to touch on the hostile environment and the fact that I think the Brexit vote in 2016 has really driven sort of hostility and uncertainty. And, you know, Scotland hasn't been immune to a rise in racism and all of that, which is, again, is playing out on our campuses in Scotland. And I think what's been really concerning is that hostile environment is being promoted either consciously or unconsciously by a UK government. You know, last year we had the then Prime Minister talking about EU citizens potentially being queue jumping. And, you know, we now have a Prime Minister who describes Muslim women wearing the hijab as letterboxes. And that really plays into a really dangerous narrative, which is coming about by Brexit. And, you know, it is affecting people who are from overseas, from either internationally or the EU, that are living and working in Scotland. So, you know, I think we've got a really uncertain and potentially dangerous situation in our communities. And, you know, so I'm glad we're getting the opportunity to look at that and look at how in Scotland we can alleviate some of those concerns and issues.
Thank you. Mr Sim.
Thank you very much for inviting me today to give evidence on behalf of University Scotland. I represent the leaders of Scotland's higher education institutions, all of whom are seriously concerned about the prospect of a no-deal Brexit. Scotland's university leaders want to be able to assure students that their opportunities to study in different countries and to settle where they choose are undiminished after Brexit. They want to be able to tell current and prospective staff that they and their families are welcome and will be able to settle and work on a basis that gives them equal rights with UK citizens. They want researchers to thrive in an environment where partnership with our closest European neighbours supports a shared enterprise of discovery. University's success and our contribution to society depends on the free exchange of talent and ideas across boundaries. It's extremely troubling to be standing so close to 31st October with the prospect of crashing out of the EU without arrangements that support this openness. We will welcome this Parliament's support for our continued partnership with our European neighbours, whatever form Brexit takes. And I can also just say thank you to my colleagues from NUS and UCU who have been strenuous in campaigning for the openness that maintains the vitality of universities.
Thank you very much. We're going to move to questions from the committee. I'll go first to Mr Johnson.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think what's clear, both from the submissions and the information that's out there, the two clear impacts on the university sector are impacts on people, be they students or staff, and also on research funding. And it's the latter part of that I'd like to just focus my attention. So we know that some £116 million worth of research funding comes directly from the EU. I understand that's about 10% of all research funding. I'm just wondering if the panel could outline just the importance of research in generality to universities, but then also specifically the importance of EU funding within that, and actually what sort of challenge the loss of that funding presents.
If I may tackle that first, I mean, I think it's a hugely important issue. I mean, one of the things that European funding does for the research ecosystem is it funds, through European Research Council, some of the really highest quality discovery-led research in the world. It's one of the things that really supports the excellence of our universities, and Scotland, with the rest of the UK, is a real leader in that environment of actually making sure that we're getting European Research Council support for world-leading science. Horizon 2020 is also really important for supporting research. It's got innovation impacts. It's going to lead to industrial advances, new products, new processes that are going to improve society. When I talk to colleagues across the university sector, I mean, the worries obviously are partly financial. I mean, research is a fundamental discovery, is a fundamental mission of universities, and will be compromised if the European funding goes. But again and again and again, what you say is really important is the way this supports partnerships. Our closest neighbours, our closest academic collaborators are most often in our European neighbour countries. And what Horizon 2020 has done is create a really well understood, smooth mechanism for building partnerships to do world-leading research. And even if one were to put UK substitutions in place, they wouldn't do what the European mechanisms have done, which is actually smooth that path to building really effective transnational collaborations with the best researchers across Europe. And I think evidence shows that the research that tends to make the biggest impact is research that's done internationally. You just get that greater fertility of perspective and idea. So we really are worried that a core mission of the universities will be compromised if we're no longer able to take part in that. I would say that the UK government's published policy has been that they would like to reassociate into Horizon Europe, the successor scheme to Horizon 2020. But I think, candidly, that looks like quite an uncertain prospect if one is heading towards a no-deal Brexit, and that is of significant concern.
Do other members of the panel have any?
Yeah. Just briefly, I suppose, to reflect on that, echoing the concerns that Alistair's already indicated. I think that when Horizon 2020 brings money into the Scottish education sector to support research, there is also implications then, indeed, for students who are participating within that research as well. Despite the tremendous work which has been done across the education sector, particularly in universities and colleges, on widening access, which has been a welcome movement, and we welcome the effort which has been put in more generally by this government and by this parliament on that issue. One of the major, I think, next frontiers of widening access will be postgraduate education, which is somewhere we're yet to make the inroads which should be making and should have been making long ago. Now, one of the things about Horizon 2020 funding means that if there is more funding in research, then there is more funding available to support research, and oftentimes that means bringing in students who are doing PhDs on scholarships to support research projects which are taking place. If that funding disappears, then that is another potential avenue for students from widening access backgrounds that will be shut down. Now, I did mention in my opening statements very, very briefly that there will be impacts on colleges and on apprentices, and I'd appreciate the opportunity to go into more depth and more detail on that later. But the implications for widening access as a consequence of leaving Europe go from the earliest stages of further education all the way up and through to the highest and most upper echelons of academia, through PhDs and things of that nature as well, if that funding is lost as a consequence of lack of access to Horizon 2020 or indeed its successor schemes. So, as President of NUS Scotland, I find that immensely concerning, especially as someone who was a postgraduate student at the University of Strathclyde and found it tremendously difficult to be so financially. I would hate to see those avenues shut down.
Just to echo the concerns, particularly around funding, but also around collaboration with European partners. And to say that I think the uncertainty is such a problem too, and the fact that our sector feels quite low down the pecking order in terms of what the UK government is dealing with on Brexit. So, you know, as we are getting closer and closer to the 31st of October, you know, clearly whether we're part of Horizon 2020 and its successors is not the top of the UK government's agenda, but is going to be so important for us here, and it's just very depressing.
Can I just follow up on a point that Alison raised about the UK government position about essentially voluntarily opting back into the Horizon programme? I mean, what steps have actually been taken? Has there been actually any practical progress into exploring that? And what are the possibilities of doing it? And indeed, are there even possibilities that Scotland could be looking at that separately? I'd just be interested to know your perspective on that.
When the UK government published a series of position papers on Brexit under the Theresa May administration, the one on science and research was clear that at that time their policy was to associate with future European programmes. And that's referred to in very general terms in the political declaration as it currently stands. And when I was at the Universities UK conference last week, Gavin Williamson also stood up and said that remained a possibility, but also that the UK government were looking at alternatives. And you know, from my point of view, I think from the point of view of my members, the idea that actually we may not be heading towards that depth of participation and partnership with our European neighbours is concerning. I mean, you can look at alternatives. I know work is in hand being led by Professor Adrian Smith to look at alternatives to European programmes. But I think it's really, from my members' perspective, second best to something that actually maintains partnerships across Europe that really do help us exercise our mission of discovery.
So just one final question. I know, looking at the breakdown by institution, that of the £160 million of research funding that was received by Scottish institutions in 2017-18, more than half was received by Edinburgh and Glasgow between them. So this is not funding that's evenly distributed. And I'd sort of be interested to know if there are, if that actually tells us something about the picture of research, maybe touching a little bit on Liam McCabe's points, but are there particular institutions with particularly high levels of exposure to this? And indeed, within that, are there particular areas of research which are, again, exposed to the risks of the loss of this funding?
I think, as you say, the Horizon 2020 funding, European Research Council funding, is concentrated in universities that have got the biggest concentration of research intensiveness. I mean, that's kind of, you know, arithmetically going to be the case, because if you've got a very high concentration on research, then you're going to be pursuing those funds quite enterprisingly to make sure that you're supporting that mission. There are other universities that have actually been successful in getting other European funds, for instance, through Erasmus Plus's support for some research collaborations that have really catalysed some important research in the modern universities, for instance. I think Horizon 2020 supports a very wide range of research. I mean, I'm conscious, for instance, that Scotland is a real leader in drug discovery, and that if we ceased to be as close a partner in the European collaboration for that would be bad for our universities as life science leaders within Europe and the world. It would also be, frankly, be bad for the common academic endeavour, that we were a more distant collaborator from what's happening at European level across that. So I think everyone has concerns There are different intensities of research, but everyone is benefiting from working in an open environment where they've got access to one or other European scheme to support their research and innovation mission.
Thank you. I was interested in all of your opening statements that you highlighted the personal impact on academic staff and their families. And with the best will in the world, a lot of research, although the institutions themselves will have individual departments' reputations will have a lot to play in that. The academic leads are really important in getting that funding. And is there any evidence of people from the EU moving to new institutions to protect, in a way, the research funding through Horizon 2020? And are they concerned that research funding won't be available post-Brexit in the UK?
It's quite hard to quantify, but certainly when members were surveyed by Universities UK about their concerns about Brexit, about half of them were saying they had come across instances of European staff either leaving or actually, I think more often, choosing not to come if they'd been offered a job here and actually they were just thinking, well, the prospects for me and my family are sufficiently uncertain that I'm not going to take that offer. And I have heard anecdotally as well, just some experience of researchers perhaps intensifying their engagement with European partners so that they've got somewhere to go if they feel that the UK and Scotland is not a congenial environment anymore for the sorts of things that they're trying to do. Overall, I think the sense is that staff are nervous rather than that they're running for the door. I think one of the indications of that nervousness is that only a relatively small proportion so far have actually applied for settled status. I think most institutions are finding that about 25% or a third of people who are eligible have applied so far. Now that may just reflect a general resistance to people who have been settled here for a long time having to jump through another hoop to show that they've got a right to stay here. I mean, that's quite natural, but I think there's also just a degree of nervousness that may reflect people actually hedging their bets and just not being quite sure that they want to stay.
Ms. Senior, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole process for EU citizens to apply for that settled status has been a big mess. And to be fair to universities, because, last year we were making a big push because the HE sector was the first sector to participate in a pilot for staff to get EU status, and we lobbied the universities to pay the fee, and to their credit they agreed to do so, and then Theresa May stood up in Parliament and said there's no fee, but the system wasn't geared up, so you still had to pay and then you had to get a refund, and it was just really confusing, and I think people having to apply for UK citizenship it's quite a personal thing, and many people don't want to relinquish their own identity, their own nationality. They see it as an attack on their identity. So I think it's really concerning that we're going to have people that haven't applied for the settled status, that are EU citizens, and how are they going to be able to show documentation to stay here? There's a real danger of going into repeating the Windrush scandal that we saw earlier this year, last year. Because people maybe don't have the documents. And that's very true for international staff who are relying on their spouse and treaty rights if they're married to an EU or an EEA citizen. And, how are they going to have the documentation? Are they going to be asked really intrusive, inappropriate questions to prove their family relationships? So, I think there's lots of dangers and lots of things to put people off from from remaining, living, working or studying in the UK. And yeah, we you know, it's just really confusing, I would say.
Ms McCabe, did you want to contribute?
Yeah, Convener, if I might expand on that, naturally I think that the main thrust of the question was about the impact on staff from that perspective, but naturally being President of the National Union of Students, I would like to raise the concerns of students in that regard as well. And I think it's, you know, like Mary hit it on the head earlier on, hit the nail on the head earlier on, which she said is this whole Brexit process has caused uncertainty, chaos and fear. And if I might read directly from some correspondence that I received from a student from a Glasgow college who is also a part-time student representative, who's Danish, she said, I don't have anything specific to say to you in order for me to kind of reflect on her experiences for all the committee members here, other than the fact that I am an EU national and I have no idea what my future looks like. Will I be able to continue studying? Will I be able to get a job after I've finished my studies? Will I be able to get a flat? Should I continue setting my roots here, or should I give up and go back? The worst thing is not knowing, and that there is no one to ask, as the people who decide these things don't know either. And I think that coming from, I couldn't have put it better myself, is a absolutely crystal clear articulation of the entropic nature and character of this entire Brexit process. You know, we totally welcome and appreciate the moves that have been taken by the Scottish Government on providing guarantees for tuition and indeed the continuity of study for EU students from this next academic year. And obviously we appreciate that it's hard with the nature of the Brexit debate to provide any longer term guarantees than that. But again, it comes back to the approach of this UK government and how they've handled this process so far. First of all, they are, you know, changing the specifics on their stance on freedom of movement post October 31st if there is a no-deal Brexit every single day. On the one hand, they're saying it ends, and then the next hand they're saying it's not. And then even though they've said it not, on their website it says that it's unclear. And that is not helpful to students like the one I just spoke of there. And additionally, if we look at the Euro temporary leave to remain system and the proposals for the Tier 4 study visa, the changes to that are only going to reflect a 3-year period of study. Now, that's a wider concern across the whole UK, not for people who are studying medicine or postgraduate education in every single country of the United Kingdom, but specifically in Scotland, because as we all know, the 4-year undergraduate degree is a central pillar, if not the central pillar, of our entire university system. And if you undermine the ability of international students to engage with that 4-year undergraduate degree programme, then it undermines the ability of students to come here in a major sense. And I'm sure that University of Scotland would share serious concerns about that insofar as what that means for the financial stability and continuity for institutions as well. I'm just aghast at the situation that we find ourselves in, and the uncertainty which has been created by the approach of the United Kingdom government is not helpful. And indeed, University of Scotland's own findings that they published, I think it was earlier this week, said that a third of institutions in Scotland are already reporting that they're seeing worrying trends insofar as interest from European students studying in Scottish institutions. This uncertainty is affecting everyone. It isn't just staff, it's also students as well. And the United Kingdom government has to do better. And any clarity this committee can demand from them and acquire for the benefit of the wider sector would always be very much appreciated.
Yeah, we've already written to the UK government in that respect and invited the Minister indeed to come to committee, but we're waiting on an answer. Ms Smith.
Thank you. I wonder if I could pursue some questions just on the back of Mr Johnson's and the conveners, Mr Sim, about the Table 3 in your briefing paper. Obviously, that was for year 2017-2018, and I think we are due to expect the 2018-19 table very shortly. Is it your expectation that the 116 will have decreased further in the next period?
Sorry, 116?
Is it, you've got your 116, 325,000. Is it your expectation for 2018-19 that that figure will have diminished?
Sorry, I'm not sure I've got the right table in front of you.
Sorry, table 3 in your briefing paper.
Is this in my
it's,
one?
I think it's taken from HISA statistics.
Oh, Spice Brief, sorry, yes.
Sorry, is it Spice Briefing?
Let me just quickly...
It's a table that Mr Johnson was referring to.
Right, yes.
You got it?
So far, the experience of institutions applying for EU EU funding from Horizon 2020 has been that it's not quite been business as usual, but they've been reasonably successful in getting resource in from Horizon 2020. But what they've tended to find is a sort of degree of a sort of polite exclusion that they aren't being invited to lead projects as often. Sometimes partners are a little bit edgy about including UK partners in case of what happens in the future. I think as one looks beyond Brexit, a lot depends on what sort of Brexit we have. I mean, if we have a Brexit with a transition period along the lines that was proposed to the UK Parliament last year, then there's a potential for us to keep going in Horizon 2020 and to be essentially continuing to be successful in this. If we have a no-deal Brexit, then I think that prospect collapses.
Can I just ask you, how many projects do you feel you have evidence for where the Scottish lead is no longer in place as a result of the Brexit scenario? How many universities are being told that they may lose their Scottish lead in a knowledge exchange or whatever it might be? How many are there?
It's very hard to quantify that. I mean, I sort of pick up the anecdotal evidence more than people being prepared to share sort of quantifiable evidence on that. I think from conversations I've had across the sector, everybody is saying that they have experience in their institution of the leadership role that they might potentially have taken being downgraded because partners have been uncomfortable about a UK university being in the lead on the Horizon 2020 project or other
Would it be possible to ask the universities to provide that information? Because I think, as far as I'm concerned, that's one of the most compelling cases where the concern about Brexit is real. And if we are finding that Scottish universities are losing their lead in a knowledge exchange or an international project, then I think it's fundamental that we know exactly how many there are and what kind of money is attached to that. That would be very helpful, Mr. Sim, if you could provide that to us. Can I just ask a little bit more about, I mean, obviously there is research funding that comes in from non-EU sources, from international dimension. And I think, again, referring back to this table, I think the 49,969,000 total that you gave, or that Spice gave in the last column, am I right that that's actually increased in the post-Brexit referendum period?
I think it has. I mean, people are looking to build collaborations wherever they can. I couldn't give you the exact figures on that off the top of my head, but I think I'm certainly conscious from my own interactions with members that while participation in European partnerships continues to be seen as really important, I think our 6 largest collaborators are in the EU. That we are part of a worldwide research and discovery endeavour, and as we look towards the turbulence of future times, people are trying to build partnerships wherever they can.
So can I just ask the question about those knowledge exchange projects that are led by international money as opposed to EU money? Have you had the same anecdotal evidence that the Scottish lead is being downgraded in any of those?
No, I haven't heard that. I've heard other stories that there can be impediments. For instance, I think that the United States tends to be particularly restrictive about intellectual property crossing borders, so that actually it's not a simple proposition that you might be able to substitute your European partnerships with other international partnerships, because you do end up with some of those partnerships having a less free environment for the exchange of ideas than you have across Europe.
So is it accurate to say that while the overall funding that comes into the university sector in Scotland may actually increase, you're worried about the balance, that the EU element in that is probably likely to decrease? Sorry, go on. Can I just finish? And the international element might actually increase.
I think it would be. I would be surprised if the international element increased proportionate to the loss of European funding. I'd be very, very surprised if that were to happen, and if it were to happen quickly, because the European funding essentially reflects the depth of partnerships that have been built over many years. And I think certainly my members would feel that actually those partnerships, beyond their monetary value, are really facilitating world-leading research, are really facilitating the exchange of ideas that maintains the vitality of universities. So I don't think there's a direct substitution there. You know, obviously, in a different environment, you would be competing for sources from different places, but I don't think there's I certainly wouldn't expect to see a straight substitution being possible there.
Okay, and my final question, Convener. Obviously, the next set of statistics for 2018-19 will help to identify some of that. Just to pick up an interesting question that Daniel Johnson asked you about different universities, is it the case that some of them who have the highest attraction for research funding are those that have a better pool on the international research projects rather than just EU ones, or is that not accurate?
I think that there is something in that because, you know, basically if you are a research-intensive university, you're building your partnerships across Europe, you're building your partnerships internationally. It's just in the nature of the research effort that it's something that needs to cross borders. So, yeah, I think there is a sort of gradient of intensity as you describe it. But, you know, coming back to the original point, the European element of that is absolutely central and fundamental. That really reflects the mature relationships with the free exchange of idea that are highly supportive of our world-class research endeavour.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Gray.
We've spoken quite a lot about Horizon 2020, but in the course of answering some of that, Mr. McCabe, you mentioned widening access and how some of that's underpinned by European funding, and I wanted to ask about European structural and innovation funds, although I'm conscious some of the potential effects might lie in FE rather than HE, but I'd just be interested to have the panel's views on what the dangers are with regard to structural funds in terms of impact.
Can I maybe make a comment? And again, I guess I'm not the expert in this area, but an institution like the University of the Highlands and Islands has, you know, really benefited from European funding, from the social fund and from the structural funds, as Ian Gray's flagged up. And, you know, I think it would be a real concern as to what is going to happen. How is that money going to be replaced moving forward? You know, I don't have the answers, but I think it's something that the committee should perhaps probe further.
I think it's a major worry. I mean, I think as Mary Senior points out, the University of Highlands Islands has been hugely supported, partly through ERDF money for quite a lot of its infrastructural investment, partly through European Social Fund for a lot of the educational provision there. And it goes beyond that. If you look at the graduate apprenticeship programme, I mean, that's something that I think is increasingly successful in enabling people to do work-based learning. It's hard to get published figures on the exact cost of that, but I believe next year we're looking at recruiting around 1,300 graduate apprenticeships, and I think SDS are funding that at around £9 million. That's an approximation. But that is supported through European Social Fund, and I think, you know, it's the right thing to do. It supports people from diverse backgrounds into education, into employment, and into successful outcomes. Now, looking ahead, one of the things that would give us more assurance is if we actually knew what the UK Shared Prosperity Fund was going to look like. I mean, consultation on that has been imminent for 2 years, so we are really, you know, well beyond the point at which we thought we might see what that looks like. I think that gives an opportunity to recreate for Scotland and for the wider United Kingdom arrangement to support regional development of our more deprived communities, arrangements that support people into education and the workforce. That's my hope, but I don't know what it's going to say because it's been so long since we were promised sight of a consultation on this.
So in terms of certainty of resources remaining within the sector beyond Brexit, of whatever kind, one of the issues that University Scotland, anyway, I think have raised before with the committee has been around the Scottish Government investment in tuition fee support for European Union students. And I think University of Scotland have made the point in the past that they would like to see that sum of money, I think some tens of millions of pounds, a commitment that remain in the higher education sector if it's no longer required in order to pay for tuition fee support for European Union nationals. And I just wonder if you've had any success in getting any kind of reassurance to that effect from the Scottish Government.
We have continued to make the point. I mean, obviously there's a political decision to be made. I don't think has been made yet about what the fee status of EU students should be going forward. I think that there's a debate to be had at political level about whether you roll forward the current fee status for a bit longer or whether you look at alternatives. But if you were to look at alternatives, I think it's absolutely essential that we keep the money that's currently committed to EU students in the system. We've got so many important things to do on widening access and on making sure that we've got the right people coming through with the skills and capabilities to support our economy post-Brexit. We've got potential to invest in at least maintaining some openness to our EU partners at student level. I think there's so many important things we can do for Scotland that to my mind, it's incredible that we're even talking about the possibility of that money being taken away from an underfunded higher education sector. So we're arguing strongly in this 2019 spending review that the Scottish Government should make an absolute commitment that that money stays in the sector, because there are so many important things that we can do for Scotland with it.
Yeah. If I might, I think Alistair, off the back of Alistair's comments, I think we'll find unanimity across the three of us on that particular point, and I think we've all collectively and separately made overtures to the government about the requirement to maintain what I think is roughly in the realm of £90 million worth of funding within the education sector, because that's going into the education sector at the moment, and even if it's being funneled through the avenue of European Union student tuition, it's going into the education sector full stop, and if that is to be removed, then that creates a £90 million black hole. And I think, considering there are going to be a multitude of black holes appearing all over the education sector in the event of a no-deal Brexit, we should try and at the very least stop from creating another one when that is within our power not to do. But in relation to your comment, Mr. Gray, in regards to innovation and structural funds, I'm not 100% sure on structural and innovation funds, but on the European Social Fund, I can certainly pass comment on the impact that will have specifically on apprenticeships in Scotland. I think that the overwhelming majority, if I'm not mistaken, of foundation apprenticeships in this country are either paid for in full or in part by European social funding. So like I alluded to earlier on in the conversation, whether it's Horizon 2020 funding being lost and jeopardising access to the highest, most echelons of academia, all the way through to apprenticeships and foundation apprenticeships, which are giving people a step up and out of deprivation and into well-paying, sustainable jobs. This has a massive impact on students' opportunities across the whole range of opportunities which exist within our education sector. And the extent to which further education and higher education continue to be useful terms in a system which is increasingly becoming tertiary by its nature. Mary made mention of the University of the Highlands and Islands, which is a combination of university and 13 academic partners who are colleges. If you look at Scotland Rural College, which is truly tertiary in its nature as well, the fact that a lot of colleges are doing the majority of their teaching hours now in higher education courses rather than in further education courses, we cannot understate that just because this specific conversation is about higher education, that the implications on that other end from leaving the European Union and the funding that we lose from doing so will then have a knock-on effect all throughout the education sector by undermining those initial steps people might take through further education and through colleges into our universities as well. And frankly, like I said before, I'm aghast that we're even having this conversation. I think we're roughly 40 odd days out from the currently established date of Brexit, no deal or otherwise, and this is something which should absolutely have been shored up a very, very long time ago. And if we are to have a no deal Brexit, it's NUS Scotland's concern, as Alistair also alluded to earlier, that it will be much more difficult to negotiate on good terms with the European Union access to successor schemes, both for Horizon 2020 and for Erasmus+, which have such a huge impact on our sector. And again, I think an opportunity later in these conversations to reflect on the impact of loss of access to Erasmus would also be very much appreciated.
Okay, Mr Patterson.
No, just a follow-up to that question in relation to retention. I can understand that argument of retention of monies in any sector. I can understand that one, this particular one, retention for support that's given to overseas students. And if that if the overseas students don't arrive in Scotland, what happens to the money? In this calculation that you're making, or the argument, have you looked at the overall benefit that the Scottish economy gets? Right, so that we fund the students directly for the entering into university, but what the students actually bring to the Scottish economy, their spend, where would that be replaced in your argument if you retained that money? Because would you replace the spend that investment makes into the Scottish economy, which is considerable?
Well, I think that is part of the contribution that the EU students make, and it's an extremely welcome contribution that they're coming here. They're contributing to our economy while they're studying. But I think, from my point of view, actually also really important that they are able to contribute to our economy afterwards. I mean, if you look at the demographic and skills needs of Scotland as a part of the UK with a disproportionately ageing population, we really are dependent on that throughput of talent coming in from the EU and beyond, and being able to settle in Scotland and actually make a contribution to our industries and to our public services. And so I think my main concern on economic contribution of EU students is that we maintain an openness that enables people to come here, put their roots down, as Liam says, in I hope, welcoming soil, and make a contribution to the growth of our society and economy.
I agree very much with that argument. And can I just indulge? It's just a follow-on question on that. And in relation to that, because I'm concerned, or we should be concerned, with regards to the value that students bring into EU students bring into Scotland, and there has been a drop of 940 over one year. But at the same time, while there was a drop in Scotland, there was an increase in England. I wonder if you've anything you can add to that, if you know the whys and the wherefores in that regard, because that's quite a significant dunt to the Scottish economy in itself.
Yeah, it is. I think it reflects obviously nervousness about what the prospects are. Will you be welcome? Well, you will. Will you be able to stay? Well, we don't know really yet. I think in England, it's hard to say exactly why there's been a slightly different pattern in England. If I had to offer a possible interpretation, is that their situations maybe sort of stabilised a bit. It was obviously the English situation was changed a great deal when EU students faced the high fee levels that were introduced in England, which had an effect on demand. And I think maybe things have stabilised a bit after that, as some EU students have decided that it's worth making that investment to come to the UK, or to England in particular, and take on that deferred fee. But it's hard without market research to really give you an absolute answer to that. That's just my interpretation.
Okay, thanks for that.
If I might reflect on that, Mr Patterson, I think I appreciate the concern about the wider knock-on economic positive benefit, which comes from having an attractive education sector which attracts international students. But again, just to reflect on a comment which was made by another student who I represent, indeed this one sits on my executive committee of the National Union of Students in Scotland, and is a Vice President of Communities for the organisation. And they've said it is incredibly worrying and frustrating that your settlement and ways in which you try to make a living, which is in no way different than that of any other Scottish or British person, is reduced to a moral debate wherein your worth and relation to society is placed in the context of mere economic value. Now, I'm not trying to indicate by any stretch of the imagination that was the sole nature of your question. I'm sure every member of this committee appreciates the wider knock-on benefits of that. But we cannot understate, and I'm sure Mary being here to speak on behalf of UCU and the sheer volume of European university staff that we have, and indeed the impact that Alistair will be able to reflect on the diversity of our campus communities of being in the European Union is incredibly important to the distinctiveness of the Scottish education system. In the role that I occupied before I was President of the National Union of Students in Scotland, I was a Vice President at the University of Strathclyde Student Union, and one of the most enjoyable parts of that entire job was welcoming and working with international students, whether they were there for the whole duration of their study or whether they were there simply for their Erasmus exchange. And it is incredibly difficult to understate the huge impact they make socially and culturally to our campuses and to our institutions, and indeed to the communities in which they are situated as a result of that. They make our universities better places, more diverse places, more colourful places. They make our students more open-minded and aware of the world beyond Scotland and the parts of the world which are in Scotland and around them, and it broadens people's horizons as well. Increases their cultural competence too. So for all those various different reasons, I think we cannot lose sight of the social and cultural impact that having an attractive education sector which is open to international students and EU students brings, as well as the economic value that they undoubtedly bring with them too.
You second-guessed my second question. So,
Apologies.
I'm grateful to the answer. Thanks for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we to Ms Mackay?
Yes, thank you, Convener. Good morning. I was going to ask you about the impact of Brexit, particularly no deal, on workplace mobility, but that's really been covered in your earlier answers. Can I pose this to you? If there is a deal, what would benefit you most? What would be sort of top of your wish list? I mean, I'm presuming it would be free movement of people, but can you maybe clarify what you would think would be most helpful to the sector?
I mean, maybe I'll start, but I mean, as three organisations working in the sector from different perspectives, one of our main campaigns for the last, well, since 2012 was the return of the post-study work visa. And, you know, I know we've had the support of the committee, we've had the support of cross-party support in Scotland, which is really welcome. And, you know, so last week we learned that that is returning. So, you know, I think that's a first step. But I think we've got to go so much further in terms of clarifying the freedom of movement, or the right to come and live and work and study here, and ensure that it's not based on arbitrary thresholds. I mean, my understanding is that the prorogation of Parliament means that the immigration bill that was in train now falls and has to start again. So we don't know what the system is going to be. I think we have to ensure that there's not earnings and income levels which prohibit people that work in our sector from coming here, and that's particularly important for early careers staff, people who are postgraduates who then go on to do some teaching that maybe would limit their opportunity to work in the sector and continue. So yeah, I think from our part, it's about an immigration system that's open and welcoming, and isn't backed up by the negative rhetoric that we've seen so often, unfortunately, and the hostile environment that's come and, you know, prevent initiatives which you know, are really damaging on campus, and when education is supposed to be about opening up and sharing ideas and exploring really controversial issues, the fact that we have Prevent and the hostile environment, it doesn't sit right with the open and inclusive approach that we wanted to have in higher education.
You. I know my colleagues have further questions on the post-study work visa, so I'll leave that one there, and they can ask you more. You talked about representations you've made to the Scottish Government regarding budget, etc. Have you been able to have any input with the UK Government as, you know, as educational institutions about your fears, you know, what you need, etc.? Have you had input, and do you feel you've been listened to?
And I'm sure, well, my colleagues can speak for themselves. You know, I think it's been incredibly difficult, and I think the relationship that the UCU in Scotland has with, I think, all the political parties, the Scottish Government and you as a committee is very different to that we have at UK level. That said, our General Secretary wrote to Boris Johnson a couple of weeks ago about the prorogation of Parliament and about the concerns over people's right to live, and EU citizens' right to live, work and study in the UK. And on Monday, our General Secretary will meet with Gavin Williamson, and I think that's a first for us as a union to be meeting the Education Secretary on that issue. So, you know, we can obviously report back as to how that meeting goes.
Okay, thank you.
Just very briefly to reflect, I can echo almost identically Mary's feelings both on NUS Scotland's position in relation to all the political parties in Scotland, this committee and indeed the Scottish Government, the positive open relationship that we have with each of those partners and with one another, and the fact that those that same warmth and openness is absolutely categorically not reflected for my colleagues in NUS UK south of the border, and indeed they have found it tremendously difficult to make any kind of significant inroads insofar as communications with the UK government. And if I, not to get too into the weeds of it, but certainly I think that comes down to the fact that the government are most looking at this from are looking at the pressures that are coming to them internally from within Parliament and from within, indeed, perhaps I might say, their own party, rather than looking at the interests of those who are coming from outside of the sphere of elected representatives who are impacting this decision on a day-to-day basis. And that's extremely disappointing for us, and I'm sure it's extremely disappointing for everyone else around this table, although they might not characterise it in the exact same language that I did. As I mentioned earlier, myself, all the presidents of who represent the different corners of the United Kingdom from a student perspective, I've already written to the Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, on a number of different fronts in relation to this, but again, as far as I'm aware, we've not received any response to that. But I hope and pray for some more openness and some more clarity in future. But seeing as, again, as I said, we're about 40 days out, I'm not overly optimistic.
Thank you.
I suppose actually maybe a slightly different perspective from the University of Scotland. I think, directly on Antrim University UK, the university sector actually had quite a lot of influence on the UK government's published positions last year. The white papers that were published about the sort of Brexit that the Theresa May administration was looking for, that then got reflected in a political declaration. But I would have to say now, when we are facing the prospect of a no-deal Brexit, I think there's a very real prospect that even though those things were understood then, if the overwhelming political priority is to leave the European Union with no deal on the 31st of October, that leaves us with very considerable anxiety that we will do collateral damage in that exercise, and that the priorities that were identified for a sort of relationship we want to have with the European Union after an orderly Brexit will just go out the window in the event of a no-deal Brexit.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Could we move to Dr. Allen?
Thank you very much. You've talked about the different prospects that exist for different types of Brexit, and specifically what a no-deal scenario might mean. As Liam McCabe has pointed out, Halloween is only 40 days or thereabout away, and no deal becomes or starts to look like more than, sadly, a mere scenario. So I'm not asking you to reveal the university sector's Operation Yellowhammer if you have one, but I would be interested to know, you've talked a bit about no deal. Is it possible to plan, and how do you plan as a sector, as student bodies, for the no deal scenario specifically, and what does that planning look like?
Talking to my members and also looking at our survey information, I mean, that there is a lot of planning going on to try and mitigate the eventualities of a no-deal Brexit. But frankly, if you speak to people at senior leadership level, are saying, well, we're doing what we can, but it's such an uncertain environment that we really don't know whether the planning that we're putting in hand will be resilient against events when events happen. As one of my members expressed, a university is like a small town. We've got the same vulnerabilities to supply chain disruption as a small town. So even if you've done everything possible to make sure you've got all your chemicals in place, you've got your supply chains protected as well as possible, all it takes is that the oil tanker doesn't arrive, you can't fill up the heating, the pipes burst, you've got huge bills, you've got disruption to student accommodation. So everybody is doing what they can to plan, but I think feeling that they're standing on very thin ice over some deep uncertainties and uncontrollables that go beyond what you can plan for as a university leader. And to give another example, I was talking to a colleague last week who said, well, what's going to happen to students when they're crossing the border? If you go home for Christmas, Do you have to prove when you come back that you're entitled to be here? When you show your EU passport, are you going to be questioned about whether you're someone who's actually got a right to remain here, you're going to produce documentation? I mean, it just adds levels of stress and uncertainty that you can prepare as much as you can for, but you just don't know what's going to happen and what difficulties may be thrown up like that.
Can I just add, I mean, that's also true for staff, and certainly at the 29th of March, a number of institutions were advising people, well, to ensure they'd got 6 months on their passport if they were going to be overseas on the 29th of March, and perhaps if they were international staff, maybe not to be overseas at the point of departure. And so, you know, clearly that's interfering with, you know, the normal business of the institutions. I think it's also fair to say that many universities have been very supportive in terms of giving information to staff and students. You know, I see the email that Glasgow sent out, the email that St Andrews have sent out, in terms of, you know, advising staff and advising EU staff to apply for the settled status, and indeed that's what we've done as a trade union. But there's only so much you can do, and as we've already spoken about, you know, people for whatever reason may not want to take those steps. So there's lots of uncertainty, and you know, it's a difficult area with which to plan and prepare, you know, thoroughly.
And I'm quite happy to provide additional reflection on that, Dr. Allen. I think that the impact on student mobility has already been mentioned by Alistair, is obviously the main concern to NUS Scotland. We find ourselves in a situation where European students are utterly uncertain whether they are able to leave the country at all in the intervening period, and if they do so and then seek to come back, whether or not they will be allowed to do so. Now, that has implications for students who are currently in Europe, who are you know, seeking to begin education in Scotland, whether or not they'll be able to access the country in order to do so, or if they're currently studying in Scotland and are seeking to get, you know, out of the country, they don't know whether or not they'll be allowed back in. But it also has, I suppose, it's not just, you know, EU nationals as well. It also has implications for, you know, UK students as well. This idea that if you are going for your Erasmus exchange at some point in the next couple of months, or if you're not there already, then what is the nature of that Erasmus exchange? And I'm keen to kind of talk about Erasmus Plus in a little bit more detail, but just talking about the mobility dimension of Erasmus Plus, are they 100% sure they're actually going to be allowed to be in the country if there's a no-deal Brexit and there is no arrangements for visas or free movement or things of that nature? You know, again, the lack of clarity here is something which is affecting students broadly. And I suppose just to finish this reflection with harkening back to another part of what my Vice President of Communities spoke to me about, who is Dutch. He came here when he was a teenager. He has made his family here, just recently having a newly born baby. But he said, I can go back to the Netherlands if things get ugly here. That's their concern about whether or not things get nasty, in the way that, you know, as Mary alluded to in her opening statement, we've not been immune in Scotland to increases in xenophobic and racist incidents. He can go back to the Netherlands and can take his family with him, but neither his partner nor his child are Dutch. And so what does that mean for them? That's totally uprooting them. It's totally changing their experience, totally changing their lives. And it is their opportunities are already limited, but it's not as if the options they have to their other options are ideal or, you know, readily at hand or convenient. So just reflecting on that mobility dimension, I thought that was important to state from a student perspective, both for Scottish and UK students going in and out of Europe, and indeed probably more so for European students coming in and out of the UK.
A couple of you mentioned settled status there and the issues around that. I think you gave a ballpark figure of perhaps 25%. Am I right in saying one of you, it's indicated perhaps 25% of students had applied for settled status? Now, obviously, there are, as you say, factors why perhaps some people might not wish to apply for that. But that is a concerning figure, given that I think everyone had assumed that the university sector would be one of the sectors where there would be a higher application rate or a relatively high degree of information about the application process available. It does certainly indicate concerns about how many people out with the university sector are applying for settled status as well. Is there anything more that can be done to work with that body of students, to make them aware of the process. Clearly, it's not a process they want to be going through or we want them to be going through. But is there anything more that can be done to make them aware of their rights?
I think it's probably going to be more of a staff issue than a student issue. I mean, I think students here, you know, well, anyway, it's one that's concerning for everyone. But I mean, I think just to echo what Mary's said, I mean, both through the management side and the trade union side, I mean, the point is being made strongly that if you want to protect your right to stay here, please make the application. But I think the fact that the application rates are so low along the lines of the percentages that you quote partly reflects a real deep anger that people who are settled here are being asked to prove that they've got a right to be here, you know, having made the choice, whether as a student or as a member of staff, to come here to build, you know, at least part of their life in Scotland, and they're being asked to prove that they're entitled to that. So I think there's an anger about that. I think there's some people might hope it will go away, but it doesn't look like it's going to.
So you don't see this as being about awareness, you see this as being about people's understandable reaction to the predicament they've been put in?
I would say from my sort of walk around the university sector, it's more about people saying, no, you know, I'm going to hold out against this as long as I can because I really don't like it, than simply not being aware of it.
I mean, could I suggest there might also be a bit of unease because, I mean, there's some well-publicised cases that we see where people who, you know, have applied and have got rejected or whatever. And so I suppose there's potentially that nervousness that you're in more trouble if you apply and it gets rejected. And I think this just, it shows the system failure for me. I mean, the technology, because my understanding is you need an Android phone to apply rather than you know, iPhones, and so there's all of these things that are barriers or difficulties. You know, it feels like the system hasn't been set up in a way that's accessible and is supporting people to use it.
And if I might again reflect, Dr. Allen, it's not just the fact that, and even if people, you know, don't feel the way that some in the university sector do about saying we're going to hold out against this and resist it for as long as I possibly can. If some people are keen to do it, oftentimes, as Mary's indicated, they're getting bounced by that system. And it's not as if it's just because of they've misspelled their name or something. Like the demands of the system when EU nationals have sought to go through it, they've found it to be, I think, in the main, surprisingly strenuous and incredibly intensive, and puts a great burden on individuals applying for the scheme to provide a great deal of evidence over a great period of time in many cases. And that naturally then, if you can, for example, the president of the National Union of Students at the UK level, Zamzam Ibrahim, is a Swedish citizen. And she has had, difficulties within her own family where the members have struggled to find certain bits of valid certification to prove that they were in the country at a certain period of their life, and then that has led that application to be queried or rejected. I'm not 100% sure, as by those who are in the position to kind of approve or deny those requests. So when you are, an academic, and we know that being an academic is a stressful job, or you are a student, we know that being a student is incredibly stressful, and these are very intense things that is going on. The lives of people in the education sector generally are very intense and very stressful for different reasons, but that is universally oftentimes the experience. This is the last thing they need, and it was totally within the power of the UK government to make this system as accessible as possible, and they have chosen not to do so. They've chosen to make it rigorous, they've chosen to make it difficult, they've chosen to add that burden onto the shoulders of the people who are already shouldering the majority of the weight of this entire Brexit shambles, and it's a disgrace, quite frankly. It's a disgrace.
That seems an appropriate note to end on, Convener.
Mr. Simon, was interested that you actually said that, people are angry about this, because the anecdotal evidence I have when speaking to academics, people's reactions, people are individuals and they react very differently to this, and some have been reacted with anger, some with antipathy, some with just worry. But I think, it kind of sheds a light on just how stressful and how much of an impact this is having on individuals. And move on to Mr. Greer.
To stick with the settled status issue for a moment. The issues that you've just raised with the scheme, everything from the fact that it only works with one of the two most popular mobile phone softwares to issues of capacity and basic competence at the Home Office. Those have all been well repeated, raised over a number of years now. We're 3 years into this process. At any point during this process, has the Home Office engaged with your organisations on either the development or now the operation of that scheme?
Well, I think the simple answer to that is yes, and we've told them it's not working terribly well. We wait to see what happens. Yes, I think we had quite a patient explanation. It was all terribly difficult getting it to work on the Apple phone, but we're in a sort of odd situation now where some of my members are actually making Android phones available to staff at various points around the university, so they can make the application. So I don't know. I guess these things are immensely complex, but just from the citizen's point of view, you would hope that interface really had been designed. I think things are a bit chaotic because, you know, from my conversations at the Home Office, people had been working on the planning assumption that you'd have a transition period, you'd have a period of, you know, a substantial number of months, and in fact over a year, to actually build systems that worked. And then suddenly the prospect of not having a transition period means things are being put in place without the proper timescale to make sure that it works, which, you know, from a citizen point of view, is just a very unsatisfactory point of view, place to be in.
And I suppose in relation to that comment, from an NUS Scotland perspective, not to my knowledge have we been engaged in those conversations. But again, we are the Scottish contingent of a wider UK National Union of Students, and I can't speak to their experience. They may have been, they may not have been, but I don't have that information readily at hand.
Yeah, I guess I'm in the same position as Liam in terms of UCU Scotland. No, I'm not aware at UK level.
And the 25% figure that was mentioned a moment ago, the Polish ambassador to the UK is doing the rounds of TV studios today because they're publishing the fact that only 25% of Polish citizens in the UK have applied to the scheme. That's obviously massively concerning to their embassy. Is this something that you have done any work with the embassies, or more obviously in Scotland with the consulates on for your staff and students from these member states? Some of the embassies have certainly been more active than others, but there seems to be a real appetite to do more now that there is this realisation of a very low application rate to the scheme.
No, I mean, it's not something that I guess we're doing or have the capacity to do. I mean, I guess I just want to reflect again at what a massive issue it is for people. I mean, I'm thinking of one of our reps who's just retired at the University of Dundee, you know, who's lived and worked in Scotland for 30 years, and then you're asking this person to go and apply for settled status. It's, you know, when it's never been an issue before, it's so significant and it's so personal to people, and it's like a rejection of, you know, paying your taxes, working in education, and, you know, participating in your communities, to then say, oh, by the way, you've got to validate your right to be here.
I suppose just again in relation to that, to my knowledge, I don't think we've received any correspondence from any of the consulates in Scotland seeking kind of a joint effort to try and increase registration via that system for students. I'm open to it, but to be quite honest, I do not know where we would find the capacity as an organisation, considering that we're already, for obvious reasons based on recent reporting, we're trying to get as many students to register to vote as possible, which is our main consideration at the moment. And we're also doing a number of other things presently as the National Union of Students in Scotland, just around Brexit. So again, taking that on as another thing would really be pushing our capacity as an organisation to do the broader work that students expect us to be doing on housing, on student support, on mental health, and on all those various things. And I think that just speaks to, if I might make this brief comment, reflects on the fact that this Brexit debacle has utterly distracted the minds and efforts of all of civic society and indeed beyond from the many of those issues which most affect vulnerable people and communities in this country. And it's greatly, greatly disappointing that we find ourselves in that situation, because whilst we are in the process rightly of trying to protect European, the mobility of our citizens and European citizens, in Scotland and across the UK, going back and forth and protect these pots of funding which make our sector relevant, it has meant that it is drawn away from the wider conversations which affect all people as well. And that's greatly, greatly disappointing to us in NUS, as you would imagine.
And Mary, just to touch on something that was in the UCU briefing, that your briefing paper mentions the immigration advice line that has been set up for your members. That's a really interesting source of information in terms of what people are reaching out to that line for advice on. Would you be able to expand a little bit on whether it's those who are attempting to go through the process and finding difficulty who are reaching out through your advice line, or is it people who are, as Alistair was laying out, are either resistant to it for a variety of very well justified reasons, or simply wouldn't know where to begin? You mentioned someone a moment ago who's been here for 30 years and over that 30-year period has presumably never required to gather the kind of paperwork that would now be needed to evidence their residency here. What are the reasons that folk are reaching out to that advice line?
I think it was very much sort of late 2016, early 2017, people that were uncertain and unsure of what the situation was. And actually, I mean, I had a conversation with our National Legal Officer before coming here, and in a way, he was a wee bit, I suppose, cynical is maybe not the right word, but he was saying that, we were paying these lawyers, but really all they could do was repeat the advice that was on the Home Office website, because that was the information that was there. But, it was obviously reassuring to, a number of our members. And I think it's fair to say that most universities, if not all, offered similar services to staff who were unsure of their their status and their right to be here, and how that was going to be affected by Brexit.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter.
Ms. Rundell.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you to the panel. I mean, I find it very depressing listening to what you have to say today, in the one sense, because they're very serious concerns. I think it's disappointing that we're at the point where that's the case, but depressing as well, because I think if we'd left in March with the transition period, a number of the things that we're talking about now would have moved on. And I guess it's a question primarily for Alistair Sim, because you've mentioned the transition period and Theresa May's withdrawal agreement a couple of times. Do you think we're at a point now where actually the uncertainty is worse than even some of the worst consequences of that withdrawal agreement?
I think we would probably rather live with a little bit of a longer period of uncertainty than face the prospect of a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October, because, as we've described over... Yeah.
The withdrawal agreement that was voted on 3 times in the House of Commons earlier in the year and the later end of last year. Do you think that it would have provided a better position than the uncertainty we've seen?
Well, I mean, it has been a matter for Parliament whether to approve that or not. I think that's kind of slightly above my pay grade, but I think, certainly we are looking for an orderly transition out of the European Union, if that happens, when it happens, and one which provides for our ability to negotiate our way into a new close partnership with our European neighbours. Obviously, that at the UK level, that's not been politically possible so far, but we want to hold out hope that it remains politically possible, because the prospects of crashing out with no deal are really serious.
I guess I'm not asking you sort of about the political bit of it, because obviously within your submission you say that your views are not a judgment on the outcome of the 2016 referendum, but the submission does seem to major on the sense that a no deal would be really negative. And I think it's a political reality, and I think other members have referenced it, that by not progressing with the withdrawal agreement that would have included the transitional period, then no deal becomes more likely. Do you think that the sector would have been better under the transitional period
Well, I can really only look to the future. I think we will be better if there is a managed transition from the European Union that keeps up our capacity to maintain close relationships of partnership and collaboration with our nearest neighbours.
Okay. Does anyone else have any comment?
Well, fundamentally what NUS are seeking, irrespective of what deals have been on the table or have not been on the table or may yet be on the table, which are witheringly close, but I doubt very much that characterisation from the Prime Minister, is we want a deal which guarantees a fair and accessible immigration system, continued membership of the Erasmus Plus scheme, protects vital funding within our sector, and does not create a hard border on the island of Ireland. And I think irrespective of whether or not we were leaving in March or whether or not we were leaving on Halloween, or whether that is pushed back as a consequence of the current political rigmarole which is presently taking place, what we want at the end of the day is that is what we want for students, irrespective of the parliamentary wrangling. I think it's incredibly important that we do not lose sight of the tangible, material, real impact this is having on the lives of people, the length and breadth, not just of Scotland, but indeed the rest of the UK. And this wrangling is not helpful in any way, shape or form to relieve people of that woe or relieve people of the concerns that they have. So long as that is delivered, NUS Scotland will be content, but ultimately we do not see a departure from the European Union in any kind of way as being beneficial to students, because as Alistair has already indicated previously, any such apolitically, I might add, any such systems or pots of funding which may be brought in to replace any systems that we would no longer have access to as a consequence of leaving the European Union would not be as good as by virtue of the fact that these are mature relationships which offer opportunities in a much broader sense. So again, irrespective of what deals happen on the table or may yet be on the table, it's not NUS's position that adequate clarity has been provided at any stage in this, and the UK government just has to do better, frankly.
I mean, we've got real concerns about a no-deal Brexit, the impact it's going to have on the sector, which I think we've covered at length, as well as staff and students within the sector, but also for workers' rights and working conditions across the UK. I mean, that's a real worry to us and the wider trade union movement.
So you would prefer to see a deal?
Our position, last year we did a consultation of all of our members, which had, a massive participation rate, and 89% of our members indicated that they would like the UK government to put whatever deal or agreement was going to happen to a public vote. So that was where we were we are as a trade union.
Okay, thank you.
Might I just a final point of clarity, just to make it perfectly clear, if there is to be a departure, there must be a deal, and if there is to be a deal, it must include that fair and accessible immigration system, continued membership of Erasmus Plus, protection of vital funding, and no hard border on Ireland. So whatever the outcome, those things have to be guaranteed, as far as we're concerned.
Could I ask, I think it's quite easy to understand what we mean by free movement of people, free movement of goods, physical goods and services. What I'm a bit unclear about, and I don't know if you can shed some light on this, is what happens to the intellectual property of the research projects that are in existing collaborations that are happening now if we fall off with a no deal?
Not sure there's a simple answer to that, because I think there is a real, if we fall out of data sharing arrangements with our European partners, then I think that may well affect science, that actually the sharing of data across boundaries is necessary to sort of give you the raw material in which you can make your research inferences may become more difficult. I think that's a serious problem. Another problem that's related to intellectual property, which we've not really touched on yet, is recognition of qualifications. So, for instance, if I were to train in Scotland as a doctor or a vet or a lawyer or an architect or whatever, at the moment there's European law that means that if I go back to a European country, my qualification is recognised there too. Now, without a managed transition from the European Union, that might fall over immediately, in which case, having come here from a European country and trained as an architect, I would be left in doubt as to whether I could practice. So yes, in various ways around sort of intellectual property accreditation, that whole sort of related set of issues, there are issues that absolutely need a managed solution rather than bursting out of the European Union without managed arrangements.
Mr McCabe?
Yeah, and just off the back of the comment in relation to professional qualifications, naturally I'm sure Mary will have thoughts on potential implications that has for professionals who have those qualifications, who are currently working here, and then they're going to be thinking whether or not their position in their jobs might be in jeopardy because those qualifications may no longer then be recognised by the UK government. This has the capacity and the potential to absolutely pull the rug out from underneath a huge number of students' feet. Students have been born in a country in their entire life, having known themselves to be European citizens, and that mobility and international mobility is something which is within reach of them as best as we can possibly raise their aspirations to realise that. And the Widening Access Agenda, I think, is testament to the fact we're broadening that hope to as many people as possible. And those students who are currently on courses, further education, higher education and otherwise, which will end up producing a professional qualification, many of them may well have gone on to those courses with the expectation that that professional qualification will be internationally recognised, and it means they will be able to work and live wherever and do the same job wherever they go, and that will be a better guarantee for them that they will be able to move around and work and live as they please. Now, if you pull that rug out from underneath them by saying, I know you're 3 or 4 years down an undergraduate degree, or you're in your master's degree, or you're doing your postgraduate degree, or a professional qualification, but what you're going to get at the end of that might not be recognised more broadly, that might totally undermine people's entire plans for their future. And again, as the President of the National Union of Students in Scotland, I find that to be totally unacceptable. And just again, it's just one more facet of the potential chaos which is going to be unleashed as a consequence of a no deal, and reveals again the deeply integrated relationship we have with European institutions and what we stand to lose out on if there is a no deal departure.
Okay, Ms Senior, do you want to comment?
I suppose I was just going to touch on the Bologna process, and I think the partnership work that we're all doing together with the Scottish Government officials, and that's about, I suppose, comparability of higher education sectors, and that we're all trying to work to ensure that Scotland doesn't lose out and our education system and the services are promoted in that process. So I think that's work in progress right at the moment.
Okay. I think that's exhausted questions from the committee. Can I thank you all for your attendance at committee this morning? It was really helpful. The committee is taking an evidence session with the UK Government, as mentioned earlier, and we conclude this public session, and we will now suspend for a few minutes and move into private.